Good evening, all, and welcome back to Dark Fears. Tonight, we journey into the cold and isolated maritime small towns of Canada, places surrounded by endless ocean fog, forgotten fishing harbors, and quiet coastal roads where the sea seems to swallow sound itself. Hidden among these lonely communities are 7 disturbing and deeply unsettling horror stories, each one darker and more terrifying than the last. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Fears for daily horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of maritime Canada, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened in the winter of 2016 when I was working as a night dock supervisor in a small fishing town along the coast of Nova Scotia. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. About 2,000 people lived there, most of them fishermen or families who had been there for generations. During the day, the harbor was full of noise, engines, gulls screaming, crates being dragged across the docks. But at night, it was a completely different world. My job was simple. I checked incoming boats, locked storage sheds, and made sure no one tampered with the fishing equipment. Usually, the only sounds I heard were waves slapping against wooden posts and the distant cry of seabirds. That December night, a thick ocean fog rolled in from the water. Fog wasn't unusual for us. But what I saw walking out of it at 2:17 a.m. was something I still can't explain. Because the man walking toward the dock had been missing for 3 weeks. 3 weeks earlier, a local fisherman named Ethan Calder had disappeared. Ethan was well known in town. He owned a small lobster boat and had been fishing these waters for nearly 20 years. People described him as stubborn but reliable, the type of guy who could survive a storm that would scare most sailors back to shore. One night, he went out alone for a short trip. He never came back. His boat was eventually found drifting about 20 miles offshore by the Coast Guard. The engine was still running, the traps were still stacked neatly, but Ethan was gone. No blood, no signs of a struggle. Just an empty boat rocking in the gray Atlantic waves. The town searched for days. Divers, helicopters, search crews. Nothing. Eventually, people accepted what usually happens out here. The sea takes people sometimes. So when I saw a man walking slowly toward me through the fog that night, I didn't immediately think of Ethan. But as the figure got closer, I started to feel something very wrong. I remember leaning against the cold railing of the dock, sipping burnt coffee from a thermos while the fog rolled across the harbor like a living thing. At first, I thought the figure was just another fisherman returning late. That wasn't unusual. Some crews came in after midnight if the weather had been good. But something about the way this person walked felt wrong. He moved slowly, stiffly, like every step took effort. His boots dragged across the wooden boards, producing a dull scraping sound that echoed across the empty harbor. I squinted through the fog. The harbor lights behind him created a dim silhouette. I could barely make out his shape, but I noticed his clothes looked soaked, darker than the surrounding mist. "Hey!" I called out. The figure stopped. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he turned his head slightly toward me. That's when the fog shifted just enough for the light to hit his face, and my stomach dropped. Because I recognized him. It was Ethan Calder. For several seconds, I just stood there staring. It didn't make sense. Ethan Calder had been missing for 3 weeks. The entire town had searched the ocean for him. His boat had been found empty miles offshore. And yet, here he was, standing 20 feet away from me on the dock. "Ethan?" I said carefully. He didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward. The closer he came, the clearer I could see him. His yellow raincoat hung loosely from his shoulders, dripping seawater onto the dock boards. His beard looked longer than I remembered. His skin looked pale, almost gray. And his eyes? I'll never forget his eyes. They looked glassy and unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing anything in front of him. "Where the hell have you been?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Ethan finally opened his mouth. But the voice that came out didn't sound like a man who had just survived weeks at sea. It sounded like someone who had forgotten how to speak. Ethan's mouth moved slowly, like the words were difficult to remember. For a few seconds, all I heard was the wind pushing fog across the harbor and the soft creaking of boats tied to the dock. Then he whispered something. At cold, his voice sounded dry and broken, almost like someone who hadn't spoken in days. I stepped closer, confused and honestly a little relieved. My brain was already trying to explain everything. Maybe he had drifted somewhere. Maybe he'd been rescued by another boat. Maybe he'd just been lost. "Ethan, what happened?" I asked. "Everyone's been looking for you." He didn't answer the question. Instead, his eyes slowly drifted past me, toward the dark ocean behind the docks. His lips trembled again. "They're still out there," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who is?" I asked. Ethan slowly raised one shaking hand and pointed toward the fog-covered water. "The ones under the waves." I felt a nervous laugh rise in my throat. The kind you make when something doesn't make sense. "All right, Ethan," I said cautiously. "Let's get you somewhere warm." I stepped forward and reached for his arm. The moment my hand touched him, I immediately pulled back. His skin was freezing, not cold like someone who had been outside in winter. Freezing like ice, like something that had been sitting in ocean water for far too long. Ethan didn't react when I touched him. He just kept staring toward the ocean. "You don't understand," he murmured quietly. The fog shifted again behind him, drifting across the harbor water. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving far out beyond the boats. Not a wave, not a boat. Something long and dark just beneath the surface. I blinked, and it was gone. When I looked back at Ethan, he was staring directly at me now. And for the first time since he arrived, he looked terrified. "They followed me," he whispered. I stared at Ethan, trying to decide if he was delirious. "Who followed you?" I asked slowly. For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes shifted back toward the harbor water again, like he expected something to rise from it at any second. Then he took another step closer to me. "Daniel," he said quietly, somehow remembering my name. "When my boat drifted, the engine died. The fog came in thicker than I'd ever seen. His breathing became uneven. I thought I was alone out there." He swallowed hard. But then I heard something moving under the boat. The harbor suddenly felt colder around us. "What do you mean moving?" I asked. Ethan rubbed his hands together as if trying to warm them. "At first, it sounded like whales brushing the hull," he said. "But it kept circling, again and again." He looked back toward the water. And then something hit the bottom of the boat, hard enough to lift it. Ethan's hands were shaking now. I grabbed a flashlight and leaned over the side. He continued quietly. His voice dropped even lower. I wish I hadn't. The fog around the dock seemed thicker now, almost suffocating. "What did you see?" I asked. For a few seconds, Ethan didn't respond. He just stared down at the wooden planks beneath his boots. Then he finally whispered, "Eyes." "Eyes," I repeated. "Dozens of them." My stomach tightened. "They weren't fish eyes," he continued. "They were big, pale, reflecting the light from beneath the water." He slowly looked up at me. They were staring straight at me. The wind pushed the fog aside for a brief moment, revealing the dark water beyond the dock. I glanced out toward the harbor, and for a split second, I thought I saw something break the surface. A small ripple, followed by another, like multiple shapes slowly circling beneath the water. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The harbor was silent, except for the gentle knocking of boats against the dock posts. The fog had thickened so much that the water beyond the first row of boats had disappeared completely. I tried to convince myself Ethan was hallucinating. 3 weeks missing at sea could break anyone's mind. But then Ethan grabbed my arm suddenly. His grip was weak, but desperate. "Daniel," he whispered urgently. "They followed the boat all night." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "They kept circling under me," he said. "Every time I tried to start the engine, something would slam against the hull." His breathing grew faster. And then, one of them surfaced. A cold wind pushed across the dock. "What did it look like?" I asked. Ethan slowly shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "It wasn't a fish, and it wasn't a whale." He looked back toward the fog-covered harbor. It was watching me. Before I could ask another question, Ethan suddenly froze. His eyes widened as he stared past me toward the water. At that exact moment, something heavy splashed in the harbor, not far away, maybe 30 feet from the dock. I turned quickly. The fog parted just enough for me to see the surface of the water ripple violently. For a split second, something pale moved beneath the waves. Something huge. My heart started pounding. When I turned back to Ethan, he looked almost relieved. "They're here," he whispered. And then something happened I will never forget. Ethan stepped backward toward the edge of the dock. "Ethan, wait!" I shouted. But before I could reach him, he turned and simply walked off the dock into the dark water. There was no scream, no struggle, just a quiet splash, and the fog slowly swallowing the harbor again. His body was never found. But sometimes, on foggy nights, fishermen still report shapes moving under their boats. My name is Michael Turner, and this happened in the fall of 2018 when I took a temporary maintenance job at a remote lighthouse along the coast of Newfoundland. I wasn't a lighthouse keeper. Those jobs barely exist anymore. Most of the towers are automated now, run by computers and solar power. But sometimes equipment fails, and someone has to go out there to repair it. That's where I came in. The lighthouse sat on a narrow stretch of rocky land, about 3 miles from the nearest small town. A single dirt road led to it, cutting through miles of empty coastal forest before opening up to the cliffs and crashing Atlantic waves. Normally, the repair jobs were simple. Drive out, fix the equipment, leave before nightfall. But the week I was sent out there, a storm had knocked out the lighthouse communication system, and someone had reported seeing a light moving inside the tower, which was impossible. Because according to the records, the lighthouse had been completely empty for years. I arrived at the lighthouse just before sunset. The wind coming off the ocean was brutal that day, strong enough to make my truck rock slightly as I parked near the base of the tower. Seagulls circled above the cliffs, their cries echoing across the gray sky. Up close, the lighthouse looked older than I expected. The white paint was peeling badly, exposing rust stains running down the concrete walls. Several of the windows were cracked, and the metal door at the base groaned loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the tower smelled like salt, damp stone, and something else I couldn't quite identify. The spiral staircase wrapped upward into darkness, disappearing far above my head. I checked my watch. The repair would probably take an hour, maybe 2. Plenty of time before nightfall. But as I stepped inside and closed the heavy door behind me, I heard something that immediately made me stop. Footsteps. Slow footsteps. Somewhere above me in the lighthouse. I froze at the bottom of the staircase, listening carefully. For a few seconds, the only sound was the wind howling outside the tower and waves smashing against the rocks below the cliffs. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate footstep from somewhere above. The sound echoed down the hollow lighthouse shaft, bouncing off the damp stone walls. My first thought was simple. Maybe another maintenance worker had arrived before me. But that didn't make sense. The company schedule only listed one technician for this job, me. Still, I called out anyway. "Hello?" My voice echoed loudly up the staircase. No answer. I waited another moment. Nothing moved. No voices, no footsteps, just silence. I sighed and shook my head, assuming maybe I had imagined it. Old buildings make strange noises sometimes, especially during storms. So I grabbed my toolbox, switched on my flashlight, and started climbing the narrow spiral staircase. About halfway up, the footsteps started again, only this time, they were above me. The staircase twisted tightly around the inner wall of the lighthouse, each metal step creaking under my boots as I climbed. My flashlight beam bounced along the walls, revealing rusted railings and thick layers of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years, which made the situation even stranger. Because if someone had walked up here recently, the dust should have been disturbed. But every step ahead of me looked untouched. Halfway to the top level, I stopped again. There it was, another footstep, directly above me. I lifted the flashlight and aimed the beam higher up the spiral staircase. The light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing. Just more empty steps twisting upward. "Hello?" I called again. My voice echoed through the tower. For a moment, there was silence. Then something moved. Not a person, not footsteps. Just the faint sound of a door slowly creaking open somewhere near the top of the lighthouse. And I knew for a fact there shouldn't have been any doors up there. I stood there on the staircase, gripping the flashlight tighter than I realized. The sound of that door opening echoed down the tower slowly, the metal hinges groaning like they hadn't moved in years. But that didn't make sense. I had checked the lighthouse layout before coming out here. The tower had only a few levels. The base storage room, a small maintenance floor halfway up, and the lantern room at the very top where the light equipment was installed. There were no extra rooms, no side doors, nothing that could open or close like that. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. The storm outside was getting worse anyway, and technically I could report the issue and return another day with someone else. But then I remembered the call that brought me out here. A fisherman from the nearby town had reported seeing someone walking inside the lighthouse at night. At the time, everyone assumed it was just a reflection from the automated light. Standing there in that staircase, I wasn't so sure anymore. I slowly continued climbing. Each step echoed loudly inside the hollow tower, making the silence feel heavier with every movement. The higher I went, the stronger the smell became. It wasn't just salt water and damp stone anymore. There was something else in the air now. something stale, almost rotten. When I reached the final landing before the lantern room, my flashlight beam revealed something strange on the floor. Footprints. Clear footprints in the thick dust. They led up the last few steps toward the top of the lighthouse. But they didn't look fresh. The edges were smudged and faded, like they had been there for a long time. And there was something even stranger about them. They only went up. There were no footprints leading back down the staircase. I stared at them for several seconds before slowly raising my flashlight toward the lantern room door. It was standing slightly open, and beyond it, I could hear someone breathing. I stood there staring at the half-open lantern room door, trying to convince myself that there was a normal explanation. Maybe another technician had arrived earlier and forgotten to log the visit. Maybe a fisherman had broken in to shelter from the storm. But the slow breathing I heard beyond that doorway didn't sound normal. It sounded uneven, heavy, like someone struggling to pull air into their lungs. I slowly stepped closer. The wind outside slammed against the lighthouse walls, making the tower groan like an old ship at sea. My flashlight beam landed on the metal door and pushed the light into the room beyond. "Hello?" I called carefully. The breathing stopped instantly. The sudden silence made my heart start pounding harder. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, very slowly, something inside the lantern room shifted. Not footsteps, more like the sound of someone dragging themselves across the metal floor. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. But curiosity, and maybe stubbornness, kept me from turning around. I pushed the lantern room door open a little wider. The beam of my flashlight swept across the circular chamber at the top of the lighthouse. Old control panels lined the walls, covered in dust. The giant glass lenses of the lighthouse light towered above me, reflecting the weak beam back in strange patterns. At first, the room looked empty. Then my light moved across the floor, and I saw someone sitting in the far corner. A man. His back was pressed against the wall beneath the window. He wore an old oilskin fisherman's coat, the kind locals had worn decades ago. The fabric looked stiff and cracked, like it had been exposed to years of salt and wind. His head was tilted downward. His arms hung loosely at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might be dead. Then his chest slowly rose, and he took another slow breath. I froze at the sight of the man in the corner. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My flashlight trembled in my hand, casting jittery shadows across the room. The storm outside rattled the glass panes violently, making the lighthouse groan as though it were alive. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. The man didn't answer. His head remained bowed, but I noticed something impossible. His coat was dripping seawater, and his boots were caked in mud. It was as if he had walked straight out of the ocean and into the lighthouse. Suddenly, he lifted his head. His eyes, they were milky white. No pupils, no iris. Just pale, staring orbs that seemed to absorb the flashlight's beam rather than reflect it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I realized then that this man wasn't alive. Or at least, not fully. Before I could react, the figure slowly rose to his feet. He didn't walk. He glided, his wet boots barely making a sound against the metal floor. The faint smell of salt and decay filled the room as he moved toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly hitting the control panel. My heart raced uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, he stopped just a few feet away. his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, unfeeling. For a moment, the world seemed frozen. The storm, the lighthouse, even my own breath. It all stopped. And then he whispered, his voice raspy like wind through a broken window. They never left. At that instant, the lighthouse light blazed to life on its own, sweeping across the stormy ocean. The beam revealed dozens of small boats, all empty, drifting toward the cliffs. I bolted out of the tower, never looking back. The next day, the lighthouse was empty again. No man, no boats, no footprints. Nothing but the fog and the echo of a warning I will never forget. My name is Clara Bennett, and this happened during the winter of 2017 in a small coastal village along Prince Edward Island. I had moved back to my late husband's hometown after his death at sea. Life there was quiet, almost painfully so, with winds whipping across the icy coastline and waves breaking against the cliffs below. Most of the town's residents were fishermen or families connected to the sea in some way. People kept to themselves, and I liked it that way. Mostly. My late husband, Thomas, had been lost in a storm 2 years prior. The sea had taken him without a trace. Since then, I had lived alone in his old house near the harbor, clinging to his memory and the routine of daily life. One night, while preparing tea in the kitchen, I heard faint knocking at the door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor. But no one in this village ever came visiting after dark. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, almost as if it were meant for me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The house had been empty for years, except for me, and the sound of the knocking felt impossibly close. It echoed through the hallway, deep and hollow. I finally opened the door. No one was there. Just the frozen wind swirling across the wooden porch, carrying the faint smell of salt and seaweed. I shut the door quickly, trying to convince myself it was the wind. But the feeling didn't leave me. Something was outside, watching. Later that night, I heard it again. This time, it was different. Closer, heavier. A soft scraping sound ran along the side of the house, moving from the porch toward the windows that faced the harbor. I peeked through the curtain. Nothing. Just the dark, endless stretch of water and the small boats rocking gently in the harbor. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was standing right outside, waiting. The next morning, I found the porch empty. No footprints. No marks in the snow except the ones I had left the night before. I tried to push the fear from my mind, telling myself it had been the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the siding. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something alive. Something that had come for me. I went about my day, checking on neighbors and running errands in town. Everything seemed normal. The locals laughed and joked as usual, unaware of the growing dread gnawing at me. That evening, I returned home to find the front door slightly ajar. I had locked it before leaving, as always. My heart thumped violently in my chest. I stepped inside cautiously. The living room was empty. No one had entered. Yet, the smell of salt and dampness lingered in the air, stronger than ever. And on the windowsill, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a single wet footprint facing toward the harbor. I spent the night in the kitchen, clutching a heavy cast-iron pan, listening to every sound. The wind howled outside, but there was another sound layered beneath it. A slow, dragging shuffle along the porch, circling the house. By midnight, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened. I pressed my face to the window, staring into the dark harbor. Nothing moved. No boats, no shadows, nothing but the black waves. Just when I began to breathe a sigh of relief, I noticed it. A figure standing at the end of the dock, illuminated briefly by the reflection of moonlight on the water. It was tall, hunched, motionless. I couldn't make out any features, but the presence was unmistakable. I blinked. When I looked again, it had moved closer to the shore. Slowly, silently, towards me. I knew then that whatever had been outside my house wasn't going away. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Old grief has a way of twisting perception. But when I stepped outside, the snow told a different story. There were footprints, not mine, not human-shaped entirely, long and uneven, as if the person or creature was dragging one leg. They started at the edge of the dock and led straight toward my front door. I froze. My breath came in short gasps, mist swirling in the cold air. No one was in sight. No voices. Just the wind cutting across the harbor. I called the local constable, who arrived within half an hour. He examined the prints. "Could be an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Even he seemed unsettled. I stayed inside that night, bolting the doors and windows, but I could still hear it. The dragging sound circling my house, always just beyond the edge of vision, always patient, always waiting. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel a presence in the room, just beyond my line of sight. The dragging steps continued intermittently throughout the night, closer and closer, stopping whenever I turned my head. By morning, I was exhausted and terrified. I knew staying alone was no longer an option. I contacted a distant cousin to stay with me, someone who could be awake with me through the night. That evening, we sat together in the living room, trying to watch the sunset over the harbor. But the calm was deceptive. Around 9 p.m., a shadow fell across the doorway. The dragging sound started again, slow, deliberate, circling the house. We watched silently as a dark figure emerged from the harbor mist. Tall, hunched, its form indistinct, but unmistakably moving toward the house with purpose. I whispered to my cousin, "It's Thomas." But not him. Not really him. We didn't move. Neither of us breathed as the figure came closer. The dragging sound became more distinct, the wet crunch of frozen sand under its feet echoing against the walls of the house. Finally, it stopped at the edge of the porch, where the snow met the door. I could barely make out its shape through the fog, tall, hunched, and impossibly thin. Its coat was soaked with seawater, frayed at the edges, and it reeked of salt and decay. Then it raised its head. A flicker of recognition hit me. The face wasn't fully visible, but the jawline, the stance, the angle of the shoulders, it was Thomas. Or at least, it used to be. He didn't speak. He didn't knock. He simply stared, and I could feel the weight of his presence pressing against me, a mixture of sorrow and something far darker. I understood then. Whatever had returned from the harbor wasn't my husband. It was something that had taken him and now wore him like a shell. My cousin whispered for us to stay calm. I didn't move. I could feel my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Every instinct screamed to run. But I was rooted to the spot, terrified yet unable to look away. The figure raised one arm slowly, pointing toward the harbor. I followed the gesture and saw the faint outline of dozens of shapes bobbing in the water, far too numerous to be boats. Some of them moved unnaturally, like they were watching. Then the figure spoke, or rather, it made a sound. A low, broken whisper carried on the wind. "Come back." The voice was Thomas's, but it wasn't. Hollow, distant, wrong. Before we could react, the figure slowly faded into the fog, leaving behind a chilling silence. I ran inside, locking all doors and windows. The fog outside swirled unnaturally, and I knew, without doubt, that this wasn't the last I'd see of him, or whatever had returned from the sea. The following nights were unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. The dragging footsteps circling the house, scraping along the wooden siding. Sometimes they paused. Sometimes they moved faster, always returning to the same spots outside my windows. I refused to go outside. Even during the day, I avoided the harbor. The villagers whispered about strange happenings, but no one could explain what I had seen. One night, I decided to record it. I set up my old camcorder by the window, hoping to capture whatever haunted the property. Around midnight, I heard the soft scrape, then the whisper. "Come back." I froze, barely breathing. When I played back the footage the next day, my heart stopped. There, visible in the fog outside the window, was a tall, hunched figure. Its face was obscured, but the outline was unmistakably human, wet, tattered, and moving with impossible purpose. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just a memory or grief. It was something real, and it had returned for me. The final night I stayed in that house, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to leave, to escape whatever had returned from the harbor. I packed a bag quietly, careful not to make a sound. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. Thomas's voice, distorted, pleading, and terrifying. As I stepped onto the porch, the snow around me was trampled with wet, uneven footprints. I followed the path instinctively, my eyes on the foggy harbor. The dark shapes in the water moved, converging silently toward the shore. I ran down the narrow path toward the town. The fog closed in, and I could feel the presence behind me, always close, always patient. I didn't look back. When I reached the village, the shapes were gone. The wind carried only silence. But sometimes, at night, I still hear the scraping footsteps outside my old house, and I know they are waiting for me to return. My name is Lucas Harrington, and this happened during the summer of 2016. I had always been fascinated by old maritime history. So when I heard about an abandoned fishing village along the rugged coast of Nova Scotia, I couldn't resist exploring it. The village had been deserted for decades, left to the winds, the waves, and the relentless Atlantic storms. Wooden shacks leaned at impossible angles. Their roofs collapsed, and the wharves had rotted into splintered piles over the water. Seagulls cried from the cliffs above, and the smell of salt and decay filled the air. I parked my car on the edge of the cliff and hiked down a narrow path, careful of loose rocks and treacherous sand. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the village, turning the empty houses into dark, hollow eyes staring at me. As I stepped onto the first wharf, I noticed something odd. Fresh footprints leading through the sand between the abandoned buildings. I followed the footprints cautiously. They were small, uneven, as if the person had been limping. The village was silent except for the wind whipping through broken roofs and the occasional crash of a wave against the rocks. Every step I took echoed through the empty streets. Some houses had doors hanging open, others had windows shattered by years of storms. I entered one of the larger buildings, a former fish processing shack. The smell of salt, rot, and something far more pungent hit me immediately. Wooden beams had collapsed, leaving jagged splinters across the floor. That's when I saw it. A single chair, upright in the middle of the room. Dust covered everything else, but the chair looked recently used. I approached it slowly. Then I heard it. A faint creaking above me, like footsteps on the second floor, moving deliberately. I froze. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I held my breath, listening. The creaking continued above me, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pacing the upper floor. I told myself it was probably just a loose beam settling, but every instinct screamed otherwise. I took a careful step backward and aimed my flashlight at the staircase leading up. The wooden steps groaned under their own weight, long abandoned, yet somehow they weren't completely silent. I debated leaving. The sun had almost set, and the shadows were growing longer, stretching across the sand like skeletal fingers. But curiosity, and perhaps a foolish sense of adventure, pushed me forward. I climbed the staircase slowly, gripping the splintered railing. At the top, the beam of my flashlight illuminated a hallway. The walls were covered in faded, peeling paint, and the air smelled of mildew and rot. At the far end, a doorway stood open, leading into a small room that appeared untouched by time, except for a single wet footprint on the wooden floor. I couldn't explain it. The village had been empty for decades. I stepped into the small room, my flashlight scanning every corner. The walls were lined with old hooks and rusted nets, remnants of the fishing industry that had once thrived here. Broken crates and barrels were scattered across the floor, coated in years of dust. Then I noticed the window. The glass was intact, reflecting the last light of the setting sun off the crashing waves below. But something outside caught my eye. A shadow moving along the docks. Slow, deliberate, almost stalking. I froze. The footprints outside the shack were gone when I glanced back at the floor, but the air felt heavier, charged with an invisible presence. A soft whisper carried through the room, barely audible over the wind outside. It wasn't words I recognized, just a guttural, wet sound that made my skin crawl. I turned quickly toward the hallway and saw a figure standing at the far end, tall and hunched, blocking the way back. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a broken crate. My heart raced as I aimed the flashlight directly at the figure. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to hum with tension, heavy and cold. I realized then that the figure wasn't human, or at least not entirely. Its posture was unnaturally stiff, the limbs too long, too thin, and the head tilted at an impossible angle. The closer I looked, the more details became visible. Tattered clothing, soaked and faded, hanging in jagged strips, and boots crusted with salt and mud. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My first instinct was to run, but the staircase I had come up blocked my path. The only way out was past it. I took a deep breath and stepped forward cautiously. With each step, the figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze pressing down, following me. The whispering sound returned, faint but persistent, like waves brushing against broken wood. I edged past the figure, forcing my legs to move despite the panic rising in my chest. Each step made the wooden floor groan beneath me, echoing in the abandoned shack. The shadow followed me with each movement, though it remained eerily still, like it was gliding rather than walking. As I reached the stairs, I glanced back. Its head had tilted slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the faint outline of a face, sunken, pale, and unrecognizable. I could almost hear the whispers forming into fragmented words. Leave. Leave. Before it comes. I didn't wait for it to speak again. I bolted down the staircase, crashing past the broken beams and splintered wood. Outside, the wind had intensified, whipping the sand and sending the remnants of nets and ropes flying. I didn't look back until I reached the edge of the village. Every shack stood silent, empty. Yet I knew deep down that something, or someone, was still watching me from the shadows of the abandoned fishing village. I ran through the village, my boots sinking into the sand with every step. The sun had fully set, leaving only a dim, gray twilight over the jagged coastline. Shadows of broken shacks stretched unnaturally across the ground, each one seeming to hold its own secret. As I neared the docks, I froze. The water was unnervingly still, almost black, reflecting only the dim glow of the moon. Shapes moved beneath the surface, slow, deliberate, and unnaturally coordinated. My flashlight flickered in my hand, revealing dozens of broken boats rocking as if occupied, though no one was visible. A cold wind swept through the village, carrying with it that same guttural whisper I had heard inside the shack. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the water. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadows along the docks shifted, and then I saw them. Silhouettes standing in the shallow water, waiting, watching, emerging from the sea itself. I stumbled back toward the village, heart hammering. The figures in the water didn't move, but their presence was oppressive, almost alive. They seemed to stretch and shift beneath the moonlight, and I realized their shapes were wrong. Too long, too thin, limbs moving in unnatural angles. Behind me, the village was silent again, but the wind carried a new sound, dragging, wet footsteps following me. I dared not turn, but the feeling of being pursued was undeniable. I reached a collapsed shack near the harbor and ducked inside, trembling. Through the broken walls, I could see the shapes in the water. They weren't just observing, they were coordinating, circling the remaining wharves and boats like predators preparing to strike. A whisper rose above the wind, almost forming words I recognized. The sea takes everything. I realized then that the village wasn't abandoned by accident. It had been claimed, left for the sea to guard its secrets. I didn't sleep that night. The sounds of the sea and the wind blended with the dragging footsteps and occasional whispers. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the elongated shapes moving just beyond and the edge of vision, circling the village, waiting. By morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed what I could into my bag, but the sense of being watched never left me. As I walked through the village one last time, the footprints I had followed before were gone, erased as if the sand had never been disturbed. I paused at the edge of the wharf, looking back at the decrepit shacks. Something shifted beneath the black water. The figures emerged slowly, their forms tall, hunched, and inhuman, glistening with seawater under the dim morning light. A voice, barely audible over the crashing waves, carried across the harbor. "You cannot leave. Not yet." I ran, my legs burning, never daring to glance back again. I reached my car at the edge of the cliff and started the engine, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. The village lay behind me, silent and seemingly abandoned once more. But I knew the truth. Something lived there still, hidden beneath the rotting wood and water, waiting for the next visitor. As I drove away, the wind carried a faint whisper across the open road, soft and almost indistinguishable. "Come back." I never returned. I've told very few people about what I saw in that village, because no one would believe me. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can see the shapes in the water. hear the dragging footsteps circling the abandoned shacks, and feel the weight of the sea pressing down on me. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. That village is one of them. The sea doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. My name is Evan Riley, and this happened during the late autumn of 2018 along the rocky shores of Maine. I had taken a seasonal job maintaining the foghorn at an old lighthouse on a remote promontory, a job that most locals avoided. The lighthouse had been operational for decades, but the automated system had recently failed, leaving it dependent on someone to keep the foghorn functional during dense fogs. On my first night, the wind was relentless, howling across the cliffs and rattling the lighthouse windows. The waves crashed violently below, spraying salt into the cold air. The only sounds that weren't natural were the groans of the old structure itself, and occasionally, the foghorn echoing faintly from the cliffs. As midnight approached, a thick fog rolled in from the ocean. I could barely see the edge of the cliff from the window, and a sense of isolation settled over me, heavy and oppressive, as if the sea itself were watching. I walked to the foghorn chamber to inspect the mechanism, my flashlight cutting through the thick, white fog. The wind pressed against the tower, making the floorboards groan beneath my boots. I checked the gears and pulleys. Everything appeared normal. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a faint, low cry echoing across the fog. At first, I thought it was a sailor lost at sea or a gull caught in the wind. But the sound was too deliberate, too mournful. It carried over the cliffs and waves, almost pleading, almost human. I turned toward the fog outside the window and froze. A shadow moved along the jagged rocks, indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. My pulse quickened. Whatever it wasn't a person, or at least not one that belonged to the land of the living. I told myself to stay calm and focus on the foghorn, but the cry returned, louder, closer, as if it were coming from inside the lighthouse itself. I tried to ignore the cries, convincing myself it was only the wind playing tricks on my ears. But the sound returned again, louder, desperate, echoing through the lighthouse walls like it was inside my head. My hands trembled as I clutched the railing while climbing the spiral staircase to the top observation deck. The fog outside was nearly impenetrable, a thick white wall concealing the jagged cliffs and the violent sea below. I could barely make out the silhouette of the rocky promontory where the cries seemed to originate. Then, through the mist, I noticed movement, dark shapes at the water's edge, pacing the rocks in slow, deliberate patterns. I pressed myself against the cold railing, heart pounding. One of the shapes raised its head, and for a moment, I could swear I saw a face, pale, hollow, and twisted in anguish. It let out a cry that cut through the fog like a knife, sending a shiver down my spine. The lighthouse, my only sanctuary, suddenly felt impossibly small and vulnerable. I descended back to the foghorn chamber, desperate to maintain some sense of control. The cries had ceased temporarily, replaced by a low hum, almost like the whisper of waves carried through the walls. My flashlight flickered as I checked the machinery, and that's when I noticed scratches on the metal panels, fresh, jagged, like claws had raked across them. A chill ran down my spine. I knew I hadn't done that. The foghorn itself shuddered as if responding to some unseen force, letting out a deep, resonant wail that vibrated through the entire tower. Then I heard it again, closer this time, just outside the chamber door. The cry was guttural, wet and unmistakably human, yet horribly wrong. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I realized the door was locked from the inside. Someone or something, was trying to get in. I gripped a heavy wrench, my only defense, as the shadows in the fog seemed to inch closer to the lighthouse itself. I held the wrench tightly, my knuckles white, as the door creaked open slowly. Nothing was there. Just the swirling fog pressing against the threshold. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a cautious step forward. Then I heard it, a soft dragging sound across the wooden floorboards. Something was moving inside the lighthouse with me. I swung the flashlight toward the spiral staircase, and for a split second, I saw a shadow dart past, vanishing before I could focus. I ran up to the observation deck, desperate for a vantage point, but the fog was impenetrable. The cry returned, louder now, echoing across the cliffs, almost pleading, almost accusatory. I leaned against the railing, staring into the gray abyss, and realized the figures at the water's edge were closer than before. One of them raised its head, and I swore I saw hollow, glowing eyes peering straight at me. I knew then that the foghorn's wail wasn't just a warning, it was a beacon for something lurking in the mist. I couldn't stay any longer. I needed to get to my car at the base of the cliff, away from the tower and whatever haunted it. The fog was thick, almost solid, pressing against me as I descended the narrow staircase. The cries followed me, now echoing from all directions, coming not just from the cliffs, but from inside the lighthouse itself. I reached the bottom and ran through the grounds, stumbling over rocks and ropes, my flashlight bouncing wildly. At the edge of the cliff, I froze. The figures were moving toward me, climbing from the water, their forms unnatural, elongated limbs, twisted faces, and tattered clothing soaked with seawater. The wind carried a chilling whisper. The lighthouse calls. I bolted to my car, starting the engine with shaking hands. Even as I drove away, I could feel their gaze following me, from the fog, from the cliffs, and from the roaring sea. I didn't stop driving until the lighthouse was barely visible in the fog behind me. Even then, I could hear it. The faint, mournful cry of the foghorn carried on the wind, echoing across the cliffs and waves like a voice calling my name. The next morning, curiosity and fear battled within me. I returned to the edge of the cliff with binoculars, trying to see the lighthouse in daylight. From a distance, it looked abandoned, harmless, almost like the night had been a hallucination. But the wet sand near the shoreline told a different story. Elongated footprints led straight into the water and then vanished without a trace. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever had followed the cry of the foghorn had retreated for now, but I knew it was waiting, lying in the misty water, patient, watching for the next nightfall. From that day on, the foghorn's echo haunted me in my dreams, a reminder that the sea never truly forgets those who trespass. That evening, I returned to the nearby village, hoping for guidance from locals. They avoided talking about the lighthouse, their faces pale when I mentioned it. One old fisherman muttered under his breath, "The fog doesn't just hide the rocks, it hides things that shouldn't exist." I felt the weight of the night pressing against me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cries returned, carried in my dreams, echoing through foggy cliffs and shadowed waves. I imagined the figures, elongated, hunched, moving silently beneath the water's surface, waiting for someone foolish enough to respond to the foghorn again. The lighthouse, I realized, wasn't just a warning to ships. It was a beacon, a siren calling something ancient and vengeful from the depths. And whoever answered rarely returned. I knew then that the foghorn's mournful wail was never meant for ships. It was meant for people like me, intruders in the territory of the drowned. I thought leaving the area would put an end to the terror. But the cries followed me, faint at first, then louder, carried by every gust of wind through the coastal forests and cliffs. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the wet scraping of elongated limbs across the rocks and the hollow, pleading wails of something not entirely human. I returned months later with a small team of marine researchers trying to capture the source of the foghorn's mysterious sound. But the lighthouse was empty, the mechanism untouched. And yet, the deep, resonant cry carried across the cliffs as if alive. The team dismissed it as the wind or echoes off the cliffs, but I knew better. Something had been waiting in the mist that night. Something patient, something that only responded to the call of the foghorn. Even now, whenever I hear a foghorn along the coast, my blood runs cold. I know it's not just a warning, it's a summons. I never returned to the lighthouse alone after that night. The cries had followed me in my dreams, echoing in my apartment far inland. A chilling reminder that the fog and the sea don't forget trespassers. Local fishermen refuse to approach the lighthouse after dark, and I understand why. The water near the cliffs is littered with the wreckage of boats and belongings that have vanished mysteriously, taken by the restless, elongated figures that answer the foghorn's call. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fled. Would I have been dragged into the misty waters, joining the shadows that haunt the cliffs? The cries of the foghorn continue to echo in my mind, a constant warning to stay away. Some maritime horrors are patient, cunning, and eternal, and the lighthouse is their beacon. I share this story not to scare, but to warn. The sea remembers, and the fog waits for those foolish enough to answer its call. My name is Clara Dawson, and this happened during the winter of 2017 along the isolated coast of Newfoundland. I had taken a temporary job as an assistant to the lighthouse keeper, an old man named Elias who had worked there for decades. The lighthouse stood on a jagged promontory, battered by relentless Atlantic storms and isolated from the nearest town by miles of frozen cliffs and snow-covered paths. Elias was a quiet man, his eyes always scanning the horizon as if expecting something to appear from the fog. He warned me not to wander outside after dark, saying only, "The sea remembers those who forget it." I thought it was an old keeper's superstition, a story told to scare newcomers. The first night, a blizzard rolled in, enveloping the lighthouse in thick, white fog. The wind howled through the cliffs and the waves crashed violently below. The lighthouse felt impossibly small, almost fragile against the fury of the storm. That night, I sat by the heater, trying to ignore the storm outside. But a low, mournful sound carried through the walls, almost like a cry for help, deep and resonant. I assumed it was the wind interacting with the lighthouse's old structure. But the sound repeated, steady and deliberate, echoing through the tower. Elias didn't acknowledge it when I mentioned it the next morning. He continued his routine, polishing the brass fixtures and checking the foghorn, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. But I noticed his eyes would occasionally flick toward the cliffs, wary, tense, as if waiting for something or someone. Later that day, while inspecting the equipment, I stumbled across a narrow hatch hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It led to a dark, cramped tunnel descending into the cliffs. Elias caught me immediately, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "You must never go down there," he warned, his voice trembling. "Some secrets are kept for a reason." I couldn't stop thinking about the hatch, no matter how sternly Elias warned me. That night, as the storm raged on, I lay in my small room, listening to the wind and the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The mournful cry returned, low and persistent. vibrating through the lighthouse like it had a life of its own. Curiosity overwhelmed me. I waited until Elias fell asleep, then quietly grabbed a flashlight and approached the loose floorboard. My hands shook as I lifted it and peered into the darkness of the tunnel. It descended steeply, the walls slick with moisture and sea spray. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness. The air smelled of salt, decay, and something far older, like the scent of water trapped underground for decades. I could hear the faint drip of water echoing through the tunnel, and somewhere below, a soft, wet whisper, almost like breathing. It was impossible to tell what lay at the bottom, but I couldn't turn back now. I descended carefully, each step reverberating against the cold stone walls. The tunnel twisted unnaturally, narrowing at points and opening into small caverns carved into the cliffs. The faint sound of water grew louder, accompanied by an indistinct murmuring that made my skin crawl. At the end of the tunnel, I stumbled into a cavern that opened to the cliff face, where the waves crashed violently below. But what made me freeze was the sight before me. A series of old cages, crusted with salt and barnacles, some containing skeletal remains, others something less definable, twisted, almost human, yet deformed by years of exposure to seawater. The air reeked of decay, salt, and something I couldn't name. And then I saw movement in the shadows, a figure hunched over, wet and grotesque, dragging itself across the cavern floor. The whispering intensified, and I realized with horror that the cavern wasn't abandoned. Something was alive down here, and it knew I had come. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hands as the grotesque figure turned toward me. Its eyes glistened like wet stones, hollow yet aware, and its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if the body itself had forgotten how to walk. A wet, gurgling sound escaped its throat, echoing through the cavern and up the tunnel like the very walls were alive. Panic surged through me. I realized that the cages weren't just storage. They were prisons, holding something the lighthouse keeper had been guarding for decades. The wind and waves above no longer mattered. This place had its own rhythm, its own rules. I backed up slowly, my shoes slipping on the slick stone floor. The figure lunged suddenly, not fast but with intent, and I barely ducked behind a stalagmite. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might give me away. I needed to escape, but the tunnel seemed impossibly long, and every step echoed like a warning through the shadows. I scrambled backward, knocking over a crate that clattered loudly against the stone floor. The figure hissed and shuffled after me, dragging its wet limbs with a sickening sound. My flashlight flickered, briefly plunging the cavern into total darkness. I spotted the tunnel entrance above, a thin beam of light shining faintly from the lighthouse's interior. Clinging to the walls, I climbed desperately, fingers numb and slipping on the wet stone. Every step felt like an eternity. The figure followed, relentless, its guttural cries echoing off the cavern walls. Finally, I burst through the hatch into the lighthouse chamber. Elias was awake, standing with a lantern, eyes wide with fear and anger. "You shouldn't have come down here," he whispered, grabbing my arm. "Now they know you're here." The cries from below grew louder, more organized, almost as if the things in the cavern were calling to each other, waiting for their prey to step back inside. Elias pushed me toward the main room, slamming the hatch shut behind us. The air was thick with salt, fear, and the faint, wet smell of something decaying. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the guttural cries from below drowned out all rational thought. He grabbed an old set of keys from his belt and moved toward a hidden cabinet, revealing a set of jars containing strange, preserved specimens. small humanoid figures twisted by time and water. Some with elongated limbs, others with faces frozen in silent screams. "These are the things the sea tried to claim," he whispered, eyes darting toward the tunnel hatch. "They are drawn to life, to noise, to curiosity. Once they sense you, you have very little time." The cries escalated, bouncing through the lighthouse like a chorus of angered spirits. My hands shook as I realized the horror of what Elias had been protecting. Something the outside world would never believe, something that thrived in darkness and mist. Elias instructed me to stay low and quiet. The cries from the cavern below intensified, now accompanied by the sound of dragging limbs and splintering stone as the creatures attempted to climb upward. I could feel the lighthouse shuddering, as though the structure itself was aware of the danger. He moved swiftly to the foghorn, manually activating it. The deep, resonant wail cut through the wind and snow, echoing across the cliffs and water. Instantly, the cries below changed. They recoiled, retreating deeper into the cavern, temporarily driven back by the sound. Elias turned to me, face grim. "The foghorn keeps them at bay, but it's not permanent. They are patient, clever, and they never stop waiting. You have to remember this. Curiosity kills more than time here." I understood then that the lighthouse was more than a beacon for ships. It was a prison and a warning, holding back something ancient and merciless beneath the cliffs. The storm subsided slightly by morning, but the oppressive sense of dread didn't lift. Elias led me to the edge of the cliff, warning me not to look too long at the black water below. The cavern remained hidden beneath the waves, but I could see faint disturbances. Ripples and shadows where the twisted forms lingered, waiting for the next opportunity. He explained that the lighthouse's purpose was not just guidance for sailors. It was a barrier. The foghorn, the cage-like preservation of the creatures, and the secrecy maintained over decades had kept them contained. Without it, they would spill into the world above, drawn to curiosity, noise, and life itself. I understood the weight of the responsibility placed on Elias. I also understood why he had been so guarded, so silent about the hatch. Some truths were too horrifying to share, and some dangers were too patient to underestimate. Even now, I feel the faint echo of the cries whenever I hear the wind over cliffs or waves pounding the shore. I left the lighthouse soon after, but the memory of the tunnel, the twisted figures, and the cries of the creatures never left me. I still wake in the middle of the night, imagining elongated limbs dragging across the wet stone, the whispers of the sea demanding attention. Elias remained behind, a solitary guardian against the horrors beneath the cliffs. I know he continues the ritual, maintaining the foghorn, inspecting the hidden hatches, preserving what must be preserved. The sea is patient, but so is he. I tell this story not for thrills or disbelief, but as a warning. Curiosity can draw attention, and some places hold ancient horrors that never forgive intrusion. That lighthouse on the Newfoundland cliffs is more than a beacon for ships. It is a sentinel against something that should never see the light of day. The sea never forgets, and neither do those who guard its darkest secrets. My name is Jonas Mercer, and this happened during the summer of 2019 in Nova Scotia. I had joined a small fishing crew on the old trawler Seaforge, tasked with checking lobster traps along the jagged coastline. The bay we worked in, Blackwater Bay, was notorious among locals for its sudden fogs, treacherous rocks, and unexplained disappearances. Our crew consisted of 5 seasoned fishermen, all familiar with the bay. Yet even they grew uneasy when dense fog rolled in one evening. The water turned dark as ink, swallowing the horizon, and the air felt unnaturally cold. Even the gulls were silent. That night, the Sea Forge's radar picked up a faint signal, far out near the cliffs, though there was nothing there. No lights, no other vessels. I felt a chill as a low, echoing hum came from the fog, vibrating through the boat and into my chest. Something was waiting in the bay, unseen, patient, and aware of our presence. We debated whether to turn back, but pride and duty kept us moving forward. The fog thickened, so dense that even the outline of our own boat disappeared into white-gray nothingness. The humming continued intermittently, seeming to come from all directions at once. Then the first disappearance happened. Marco, our youngest crew member, leaned over the side to check a trap, and in an instant, the fog swallowed him whole. I reached for him, but the boat rocked violently, and all I could see was a ripple fading into the black water. No scream, no splash, just gone. Panic set in. Our seasoned crew exchanged fearful glances, realizing that the bay wasn't just foggy or treacherous, it was alive, watching us, taking what it wanted. The humming intensified, almost like a song of the deep, and I knew in that moment that this was no ordinary storm or accident. Every instinct screamed at me to flee. But the fog had other plans. The fog pressed against the Sea Forge like a living wall, thick and suffocating. Each of us was on edge, glancing over the rails as though the next person might vanish without a sound. I clutched the wheel tightly, my knuckles white, while the remaining crew tried to locate Marco in the water. But it was impossible. The fog swallowed every sound and shape. Then came the second disappearance. Paul, our navigator, had leaned over to adjust the radar when a strange, cold current pulled at him. He didn't even cry out. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, pulled silently into the black water that seemed to consume all life. The humming grew louder, almost triumphant, vibrating through the hull as if the bay itself were laughing. We realized in horror that the bay was selective, patient, and cruel. It wasn't just the fog or the waves, it was a predator, and it had marked us one by one. Desperation took over. The remaining crew shouted Marco and Paul's names into the fog, but no sound returned, only the low, resonant humming that seemed to echo from the water itself. It wasn't natural. It had intent, a rhythm that suggested consciousness. I scanned the radar, trying to find anything, another vessel, an underwater obstruction, but the readings were corrupted, flickering like static. It was as if the bay was hiding itself, shielding its secrets. By nightfall, the fog had thickened further, turning the world into a gray void. Strange shapes began to materialize at the edges of our vision, forms beneath the water, gliding just under the surface, moving in unnatural patterns. One glance, and I swore I saw pale, humanoid figures with elongated limbs, watching us patiently, waiting for a mistake. I understood then that Blackwater Bay was alive in ways no one should ever witness, and that every crew member aboard had already been judged by its unseen eyes. By the 5th hour in the fog, fear had completely overtaken us. Only 3 of us remained on deck, trembling and soaked to the bone from the icy waves crashing against the hull. The bay's unnatural silence had returned between the hums, making the world feel hollow, as if time itself had stopped. Then came the 3rd disappearance. Thomas, our oldest and most experienced crew member, leaned over the rail to throw a lifebuoy near a floating trap. Before I could react, the water erupted in a sudden whirlpool, dragging him down. His scream was muffled, swallowed by the depths. The boat rocked violently, and I almost fell overboard myself. I realized there was no logic, no accident at play. Blackwater Bay didn't just kill. It chose, it toyed, it waited. The fog wrapped around us like a predator, and every heartbeat felt like it was being measured, recorded, cataloged. The bay was testing us. I gripped the wheel with both hands, sweat and seawater dripping down my face. Only my best friend Liam and I remained. The fog was so dense we could barely see a few feet ahead, and the hum had grown louder, now resonating through the hull as if the entire bay was alive. I tried to steer the Sea Forge back toward the safety of the harbor, but the compass spun wildly, useless against the bay's control. Shadows moved beneath the water, shapes that shouldn't exist, pale and elongated, sometimes partially breaking the surface, always watching, always calculating. Then, without warning, a massive wave slammed against the port side, nearly tipping the boat. Liam screamed as the water dragged him toward the edge, and I lunged to grab his arm. For a heart-stopping second, his fingers slipped from mine, and the black water swallowed him whole. I was alone. The bay had taken its full toll, and the hum now surrounded me, victorious and ominously patient. The Sea Forge drifted aimlessly, the compass useless and the fog unyielding. I was completely alone. My heart pounding, every creak of the hull sounding like a whisper from the abyss. The hum continued, now a low, insistent chant, vibrating through the wood and metal, pressing against my chest as if trying to pull me into the water. I caught glimpses of shapes just below the surface, elongated, pale figures gliding effortlessly through the black water. Their movements were coordinated, deliberate, as if they were searching for weaknesses, measuring my fear. I realized the bay itself was a predator, and the fog, the waves, and the hum were all part of its hunting strategy. I remembered the stories the locals had whispered, ships that vanished without a trace, fishermen who never returned, and lights that appeared in the fog, guiding them toward doom. Now, I understood. Blackwater Bay was alive, and I was the final prey it had chosen. Hours passed, though time felt meaningless in the thick fog and relentless waves. The hum intensified, now surrounding me entirely, echoing off invisible cliffs and waves, vibrating through every bone in my body. I clutched the wheel for dear life, unwilling to surrender to the water, though I knew it was only a matter of time. Then I saw a faint glow ahead, distant and flickering, like lantern light, but muted and unsteady. I steered toward it desperately, hoping for a way out. But as I approached, the glow split into several points, moving with uncanny precision, like torches guided by unseen hands beneath the fog. Panic surged. I understood then that the light wasn't a beacon of hope. It was a lure. The bay didn't want to drown me by accident. It wanted me to choose the trap, to drift willingly into its waiting arms. I followed the flickering lights, heart hammering, knowing instinctively they were guiding me deeper into the fog. The water beneath the Sea Forge was unnaturally still now, a black mirror reflecting the faint glow, and the hum had become almost musical, hypnotic, weaving into my thoughts. Suddenly, I realized the figures beneath the surface had multiplied. Hundreds of pale, elongated shapes glided silently, surrounding the boat like predators circling prey. I wanted to turn back, but the light seemed to compel me forward. The fog pressed in tighter, muffling every sound except the insistent hum that now felt alive, sentient, aware of my every move. I understood the full horror of the bay. It didn't need to drown me immediately. It wanted fear, submission, the slow realization that escape was impossible. Every choice I made was being observed, measured, and manipulated by something ancient and malevolent that ruled these waters. The boat drifted further into the bay as the lights converged ahead, revealing a massive whirlpool swirling silently, sucking in fog and water like a black mouth waiting to devour me. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the hull and into my chest. I fought the urge to surrender, desperately turning the wheel and revving the engine, but it was useless. The Sea Forge was at the mercy of the bay. Shadows rose from the depths, humanoid but impossibly elongated, their pale forms twisting and reaching toward the boat. I screamed, but the sound was drowned by the echoing hum and the roar of water. Somehow, against all odds, the whirlpool spat the boat out near the bay's edge at dawn. I was the sole survivor, trembling and drenched. And when I looked back, the fog had lifted, leaving no trace of the horrors below. I never returned to Blackwater Bay. Some waters are alive, patient, and eternal, and the bay still waits.